In August 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic in China, I experienced a series of events that revealed the overbearing, unreasonable, and ignorant aspects of government policies. This story unfolds my observations and experiences in Xinjiang since April, presented in a neutral and factual manner. April 8th marked the end of my nearly 3-month-long home quarantine in Wuhan, as the lockdown was finally lifted. With Xinjiang gradually reopening since March, my work required me to return there as soon as possible. My journey back to Xinjiang was fraught with delays. The direct flight on China Southern Airlines kept getting postponed. Reluctantly, I had to transit through Xi'an. Before leaving, I reported my health status to the community in Changji City, where I was to stay. They assured me that with green health codes and a recent negative nucleic acid test, I would only need to self-observe, not quarantine. In Xi'an, I faced an unexpected change. I was informed that I had to move from the Pearl economy class to the last few rows of the plane, as per Urumqi Diwapu Airport's instructions. Astonishingly, this downgrade even required me to pay an additional fare. The flight to Urumqi had a peculiar arrangement. The front rows were for passengers from Xi'an, while the last 5 were exclusively for those from Hubei, including Wuhan. Upon landing at Diwapu Airport, our plight took a bizarre turn. The observation team boarded and registered everyone in the last 5 rows. They collected our boarding passes and IDs, informing us of a mandatory centralized quarantine. Inexplicably, we were not segregated from those who had started their journey in Xi'an. We were herded into a corner of the airport, awaiting further instructions. After 4 hours of uncertainty, a bus finally arrived. Filling out forms and scanning QR codes, we were informed that the teams handling our registration and observation were not communicating with each other. The bus, with an unsure driver, eventually took us to a quarantine facility in Changji. At the hotel, the bureaucratic process was repeated. The 7th time since our arrival, we filled out identical information before finally settling into our rooms as dawn broke. The 14-day centralized quarantine was mundane, marked only by daily meals and temperature checks. However, 4 particular instances stood out, revealing the chaotic and inefficient nature of the system. The quarantine meals in Xinjiang were a significant challenge for many. Uniformly arranged with no consideration for varied dietary needs, the meals left many, especially those new to the region, struggling with hunger for the entire 14 days. For me, having been in Xinjiang for some time, I managed to adapt, whether it was meatball soup or lagman, despite the meals often being insufficient. Initially, we were allowed some flexibility. The observation team permitted us to order essentials from designated stores, including food and daily necessities. This was a relief, as these items were delivered to our doors. However, unexpectedly, this permission was revoked, even for something as simple as fruit sent by relatives. The reason? An inspection by a supervisory team. This sudden change left us questioning. Was it a breach of rules, or just an overly cautious measure? Among us was a person, let's call him A. His story was particularly moving. A's father, stranded in Urumqi and suffering from a cerebral hemorrhage, was in dire need of care. With the lifting of Wuhan's lockdown, A rushed for his father's assistance. Despite having a recent negative test report, his pleas for exemptions were denied, trapping him in quarantine while his father's condition worsened and eventually led to his passing. A, unable to even attend his father's farewell, had to delegate the signing authority to a friend. This incident, among others, highlighted the severity of the quarantine regulations, often overlooking the critical need for human empathy and consideration. Another case in point was of a man on the floor above us. On the brink of his release after 14 days, his excitement led him to peek out of his room, a minor infraction that resulted in an additional 14-day quarantine. This strict enforcement, with loudspeaker announcements reiterating the rules, raised questions about the proportionality of actions and the additional strain it placed on national resources. After 14 long days, my quarantine finally ended. On the 15th day, I underwent a nucleic acid test, with results arriving that evening. Freedom came on the morning of the 16th, but not without its complications. Before leaving, I checked in with the community and the observation team, clarifying if I needed to wait for a community pickup. They informed me I was free to leave immediately. For A, my fellow quarantine traveler, this posed a challenge. Securing a ticket from Xinjiang to Wuhan wasn't easy. Interestingly, the nucleic acid test report was never handed to us. Instead, we received a mere notification marking the end of our quarantine. Back at my rented apartment, I proactively reported my situation to the community, only to be informed that an additional 14-day home quarantine was mandatory. Despite prior confirmations that no further quarantine was needed post the centralized one, the rules had changed. Community officials and police officers arrived at my door, insisting I sign a home quarantine notice. My request for official documents was met with the revelation that it was a verbal directive, highlighting the fluidity of pandemic policies. Sharing the apartment with a colleague who wasn't required to quarantine posed another dilemma. To avoid impacting his work, I opted to self-quarantine at a hotel approved by the community. I settled into a hotel close to my work and residence. Quarantine life resumed, with meals delivered to my door. Yet, an inspection 5 days later by a supervisory team deemed my arrangement non-compliant due to improper disposal of trash. Consequently, I was moved back to a centralized quarantine hotel for an additional 9 days. With no explanation, I found myself in an extended quarantine in Changji City, lasting a total of 30 days. By May 21st, after completing all formalities and receiving a health certificate, I was finally recognized as normal by the local authorities. Despite being compliant, the journey wasn't over. With my ID from Wuhan, I faced continuous scrutiny. From May 21st to June 1st, I answered numerous calls daily from various departments, verifying my information repeatedly. Entering June, I hoped for relief, but my Wuhan ID continued to pose challenges. Despite having a green health code and all necessary documentation, my Wuhan origin meant additional verification processes everywhere I went. In Xinjiang, the rules differed for those not from Hubei. If your ID wasn't from Hubei, even coming from Wuhan with a negative test report meant no quarantine or scrutiny. Yet for me, the checks persisted. After 14 long days, my quarantine finally ended. On the 15th day, I underwent a nucleic acid test, with results arriving that evening. Freedom came on the morning of the 16th, but not without its complications. Before leaving, I checked in with the community and the observation team, clarifying if I needed to wait for a community pickup. They informed me I was free to leave immediately. For my fellow quarantine traveler, this posed a challenge. Securing a ticket from Xinjiang to Wuhan wasn't easy. Interestingly, the nucleic acid test report was never handed to us. Instead, we received a mere notification marking the end of our quarantine. Back at my rented apartment, I proactively reported my situation to the community, only to be informed that an additional 14-day home quarantine was mandatory. Despite prior confirmations that no further quarantine was needed post the centralized one, the rules had changed. Community officials and police officers arrived at my door, insisting I sign a home quarantine notice. My request for official documents was met with the revelation that it was a verbal directive, highlighting the fluidity of pandemic policies. Sharing the apartment with a colleague who wasn't required to quarantine posed another dilemma. To avoid impacting his work, I opted to self-quarantine at a hotel approved by the community. I settled into a hotel close to my work and residence. Quarantine life resumed, with meals delivered to my door. Yet, an inspection 5 days later by a supervisory team deemed my arrangement non-compliant due to improper disposal of trash. Consequently, I was moved back to a centralized quarantine hotel for an additional 9 days. With no explanation, I found myself in an extended quarantine in Changji City, lasting a total of 30 days. By May 21st, after completing all formalities and receiving a health certificate, I was finally recognized as normal by the local authorities. Despite being compliant, the journey wasn't over. With my ID from Wuhan, I faced continuous scrutiny. From May 21st to June 1st, I answered numerous calls daily from various departments, verifying my information repeatedly. Entering June, I hoped for relief, but my Wuhan ID continued to pose challenges. Despite having a green health code and all necessary documentation, my Wuhan origin meant additional verification processes everywhere I went. In Xinjiang, the rules differed for those not from Hubei. If your ID wasn't from Hubei, even coming from Wuhan with a negative test report meant no quarantine or scrutiny. Yet for me, the checks persisted. Mid-June brought a significant shift in my experience. A work trip to Hami was on the cards, and I took all the necessary steps, reporting to the community and consulting with the Epidemic Prevention Center. The green health code in my possession meant I could travel without issues. The journey to Hami was smooth, albeit with the usual half-hour questioning at stations. The real challenge arose on my return to Urumqi. Here, the rules were different. The station observation team informed me that entering Urumqi from another part of Xinjiang was akin to arriving from outside the region. I found myself detained, which also impacted other passengers in my compartment. During interrogation, I explained my situation, showing my green code and the fact that I had only been to Hami that day. However, the reason for this scrutiny was my Wuhan ID. Despite having been in Xinjiang since April 21st and completing a month of quarantine, my explanations fell on deaf ears. Authorities delved into my history since April, contacting various offices for confirmation, detaining me for an hour. My proof and compliance seemed irrelevant against my Wuhan ID. Following this ordeal, I expressed to my leaders my reluctance to travel for work, especially to Urumqi, choosing instead to stay in Changji. Despite assurances of no discrimination against people from Wuhan, my experience suggested otherwise. Around July 10th, I started receiving calls again, confirming my details. Something felt amiss. On July 11th, a late-night call from the police station inquired in detail about my 3 months in Xinjiang. The next morning, to my astonishment, the community informed me of another quarantine requirement. Already 3 months in Xinjiang, and having completed a month of quarantine, I was now being told to prepare for another stint, with no clear reason or duration. At the observation hotel, I found myself among 54 people on a list generated by big data, with no explanation as to why we were selected for additional quarantine. Despite our attempts at reasoning, the decision stood firm. Frustrated, we collectively demanded answers. Calls were made to higher authorities, but no satisfactory explanation was provided. Ultimately, it was decided that we would undergo a one-day quarantine followed by testing, with the possibility of release if tests came back negative. This marked my third quarantine in Xinjiang, a testament to the unpredictability and challenges of navigating pandemic measures in these unprecedented times. During our quarantine, we, the quarantined, communicated and realized we had no clear connections or commonalities. The only link I could think of was my visit to Hami a month earlier. After a day of quarantine, our night was interrupted by the observation team and nurses for sample collection. The next morning, we were escorted for CT scans. Surprisingly, right after these tests, we were released without any reports or results from either the nucleic acid plus antibody tests or the CT scans. This was my third set of tests in Xinjiang, and yet again, no report was provided. My confusion persisted until I saw the news on July 15th about Urumqi's lockdown starting July 16th. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit. Post-lockdown, travel between Changji and Urumqi was halted. Inside Changji, however, life continued as usual. We queried the community about leaving Xinjiang, and they said it was feasible with a recent nucleic acid test report and an available flight. Yet, reaching the airport, now cut off from Urumqi, seemed an unsolvable riddle. As days passed, Urumqi's cases gradually rose, but Changji remained a mystery. Suddenly, on July 26th, Changji's lockdown was announced, leading to a rush for supplies and eventual sealing of our neighborhood. Our team, residing in 3 separate apartments, had initially used one as a kitchen. With the new lockdown, our access to this communal space was restricted. The community's mass testing on July 29th offered no hope of reports, a pattern we were becoming accustomed to. Determined to find a way out, we learned that local hospitals could perform tests and provide reports. However, upon visiting them, I found an overwhelming crowd and no testing. Calls to various health institutions offered no clear solution. That evening, our freedom was further restricted with the sealing of our unit doors. Our request for meals was met with denial. The building management suggested either buying kitchenware to cook ourselves or all 5 of us, men in our 30s, squeezing into the kitchen apartment. These solutions, according to the management, were more practical than our proposal of having meals delivered for a fee. July 31st brought a mix of relief and frustration. The good news, we were finally allowed to have meals delivered, ending our hunger. The bad news, however, was a significant setback. For anyone wanting to leave Xinjiang, a new mandate required completing a 14-day home quarantine, followed by nucleic acid and antibody testing. Only those who passed could leave the region. This meant another quarantine waiting for me in Wuhan. Now, let me share my personal thoughts on the epidemic prevention work in Xinjiang. Remember, these are my views, not necessarily reflecting the complete picture. Firstly, the grassroots workers in Xinjiang are incredibly overworked. They face a massive workload daily, with no unified standards or clear instructions. This often leads to confusion and inconsistent enforcement. Xinjiang's epidemic prevention efforts, in my opinion, fall short. There seems to be a one-size-fits-all policy, ignoring economic impacts and the lack of travel. It's not so much effective control, but rather a lack of exposure due to limited travel. The chaos is evident in the lack of communication and data sharing between departments. Every station, community and organization operates in isolation, leading to redundant data collection and inefficiency. Despite having green health codes and other digital proofs, these aren't given due respect. Overwhelmed grassroots workers resort to simple blanket policies to minimize their own risk and workload. From my experience, testing standards, particularly throat swabs, were subpar. Additionally, I never received any reports from the multiple tests I underwent. The only reassurance was the lack of contact from the community, hinting at negative results. Contact tracing seems either non-existent or ineffective. Stricter measures for outsiders contrast sharply with the lax approach for locals. This inconsistency undermines the entire effort, making it appear more like a superficial task rather than a thorough health initiative. Despite Urumqi's 16-day lockdown and Changji's 6-day lockdown, infection rates are on the rise. Questions arise about the true number of infections and the transparency of reported cases. Finally, the overall epidemic prevention in Xinjiang lacks transparency and logic. The residents, including community workers, are often kept in the dark. There's a dire need for clarity and honesty in reporting and handling this pandemic. How long will this epidemic last? When will the authorities provide the much-needed data and information? These are questions that remain unanswered, leaving many of us in a state of uncertainty. As we navigate these challenging times, stories like mine from Xinjiang during the COVID-19 pandemic shed light on the complexities and often the contradictions in managing such a crisis. The experiences I shared today, from the stringent quarantine measures to the lack of transparency in epidemic prevention efforts, highlight the need for a balanced, informed and empathetic approach in public health policies. These personal accounts aren't just narratives. They are reflections of real-life struggles and resilience in the face of unprecedented challenges. They remind us of the importance of understanding, patience and unity as we all work towards overcoming this global health crisis. If you found this story insightful and wish to hear more such real-life experiences and perspectives, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support motivates us to bring more such content to you. Don't forget to like this video and follow us for updates on new releases. Together, let's stay informed and connected.